All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I've had a great time at this conference so far and been enjoying these talks. My name is Sam Wilhelm. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee. And today I'll be giving y'all a bit of an overview on fire frequency and seasonality and the effects these things have on our native bee communities. So in today's talk, I'm going to be starting with an overview of native bee diversity in Eastern North America. I'll then talk about some of the direct effects that fire has on bees via the nesting and diversity. I'll then talk about indirect effects of fire on bees via their interactions with floral resources. And I'll conclude with a case study that I'm involved in on the Cumberland Plateau. So native bees are this really diverse group of organisms. There's at least 770 species native to Eastern North America, and these are distributed across 6 different families and over 24 different genera. And one of the really interesting things about native bees is that because they're native to this continent, they've co-evolved with a lot of the native plants. So around a quarter of our bees are what we call floral host specialists. This means they only collect resources from a distinct group of plants, often just a single genus or even a single species. And because of this, open habitats such as the oak savannas we're all interested in that have a really highly diverse forb community, these tend to be really good bee habitats and support a wide diversity of species. So the study of bees and fire is something that's still somewhat in its infancy, I would say. However, around the world, there's been enough studies to where we can begin to get a general sense of the effect. And what we see is that fire tends to have an overall positive effect on bee richness and the pollination of bee plants. And this has been demonstrated in bee communities, again, across multiple ecosystems in North America and around the world. And in oak forests, bee diversity has been, again, positively associated with fire frequency. And this is especially the case when management is paired with canopy thinning. So fire and canopy thinning, as we've seen in previous talks, are both things that allow more light to hit the understory and promotes the diversity of herbaceous forbs. And fire in general has a pretty profound impact on bee habitat. And so bees have 2 primary habitat requirements. They need the space and the materials to make their nests, and they need to be able to provision these nests with pollen and nectar that they collect from flowering plants. And in the fire-prone savanna where I work in Tennessee, we found a number of taxa that are considered rare across their range. And one of them is this species, Anthidium maculifrons. This is a really interesting species of wool carder bee, and they make these fascinating above-ground nests out of leaf and stem pubescence. So female bees go around and they strip the hairs off of hairy plants, and they make a nest above ground that, as you can see, it's the equivalent of like a cotton ball. And so I was lucky to find a nest. It's sort of like finding a needle in a haystack, but you can see the female, she's beginning to finish up her nest. She's going to close off the entrance, and inside that little cotton ball is an egg and a ball of pollen and nectar that the developing bee is going to eat. And like I say, this species is pretty rare, but we found that it's really locally abundant at this fire-restored savanna. And part of the reason I think that is that there's this really robust population of goat's rue, which is pictured on the bottom right. And as far as we can tell, this population of Anthidium is completely specialized on this population of goat's rue, which really flourishes in its flowering immediately after this section of the savanna is burned. So native bees have a really diverse variety of nesting habitats. They nest both above and below ground. Most species nest below ground, but those that nest above ground, occupy a variety of different interesting nesting sites, including the stems of dead plants or holes in trees and a variety of other types of cavities. And for these bees that nest above ground, it's been shown that fire doesn't necessarily have a negative impact on their nesting success as long as the fire is patchy enough or of low intensity, and it allows some of the nests to persist, or it allows refugia to exist where adult bees can wait out a fire. And for bees that nest underground, it turns out that this is actually kind of the best place to be during a fire because the heat from an above ground fire only penetrates a few inches at most below ground. And most bees are developing much deeper underground, and they're totally unharmed by fire. And in fact, it's been shown that ground nesting bees may sometimes prefer to nest in recently burned areas. That's what's been shown in the study from a tallgrass prairie, where they used what are called emergence traps. They're these tent-looking things on the far right. So the way this works is that anything that's nesting in the ground beneath that tent, when they leave their nests, they are eventually funneled up into a trap at the top. And in the graph in the middle, this is the estimated number of species in burned and unburned plots. And as you can see, within one of these little trap sections, there can be over 6 different species nesting in the ground. And they also saw in the graph on the far left that the total estimated active nests on the y-axis was significantly higher in burned prairie as compared to unburned prairie. And it's also been shown that fire plays an important role in the nesting success of cavity nesting bees. So in the graph on the right, we have the nesting success of cavity nesting bees. The authors of the study used trap nests as a way of observing this. And nesting success is quantified as the number of bees that successfully emerge from these traps. And on the x-axis, we have the time since burn. And as you can see, there's this really steep decline in nesting success as we depart from the time when that burn occurred. And in the graph on the right, we have a variety of different parameters that the authors of the study, hypothesized might be driving this pattern. And then as you can see at the very top, time since burn had by far the most profound effect in driving this pattern. And other studies have shown that bee diversity in general declines with time since fire. So this is a study done from savannas in North Carolina. And on the y-axis, we have the number of bee species they were collecting per sample. And on the x-axis, we have different applications of fire. And they found that when they sampled in the year of burn, the diversity of their species per sample was highest. And then a year and 2 years previous, sampling a year and 2 years after a fire, roughly the same, but still lower than the year of burn. And then all of the fire-treated plots had higher diversity than the unburned control plots. So those are some of the direct effects that fire can have on bees, but what's perhaps of even more importance are these indirect effects that fire has on the flowering plants that native bees depend on. And as I'm sure many of you know, there's a wealth of studies showing that fire causes plants to not only increase their flowering or increase nectar production, nectar concentration, but it can even act as the phenological trigger for a plant to start flowering. That's the case for the goat's rue that I showed earlier. So fire is really important for getting the plant community that bees depend on going. And fire also, of course, historically oppressed encroachment by grass and woody plant species. These are things that compete with the forb community for things like space and light. So a really important thing to consider if you're studying bee plant interactions or any type of pollinator plant interaction is the number of individual interactions that occur between different species of plant and different species of bee. And this is what we call interaction richness. And so in the graph on the left, we have interaction richness on the y-axis, and on the x we have different fire regimes, plots burned either every year, every 2 years, every 4 years, or an unburned control. And what they have found, and this is from northern Florida, is that sites that are burned every 4 years had the highest stable interaction richness numerically. It's not significantly different from every 2 years, but these rates of burning are both supporting higher interaction richness than areas burned annually or unburned controls. And it's interesting because this pattern that we see for interaction richness closely follows what they saw for bee richness on its own. And it's also important to consider how specialized the community of insects you have is in a given savanna or savanna restoration. And in the tropical savannas of Brazil, they have some data sets that unfortunately we haven't built yet here in the US, where they've been observing plant-insect interactions for, at this point, nearly 20 years in a variety of different restoration settings. And I will add a caveat that this study is looking at floral visitors. So there are some non-bee insects that visit flowers included, but the bulk of this data set is bees native to tropical Brazilian savannas. And what they found is that species specialization of the insects decreases with time since fire. And what is meant by species specialization is the number of different floral partners that an insect interacts with compared with the full number of different plant species that it could have interacted with. So again, we see that with time since fire, species become less specialized and more generalized in their foraging habitats, while the plants actually increase their specialization. And so the exact reason for this is a little unclear, but it could be that in the time since fire, there's what's called like resource enhancement, where more plants begin to show themselves and the bees therefore begin to visit more and more plant species. And this could especially, this pattern could be exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the types of plants that come in areas that are unburned are woody plant species that have these really giant floral abundance and mass flowering events, sort of like the different sumac species that we deal with in temperate savannas. So I would say it's very important to pay attention to how floral resources are changing in response to fire, because this is going to be the best predictor or indicator of the native bee community, even if you're unable to sample the bees in a meaningful way. So some research done in the longleaf pine savannas of northern Florida looked at how the season of fire affects the mean number of flowering species, which is on the y-axis here. And they asked the question, like, does this change across time? And what we see is that there are some immediate effects of fire on the mean number of flowering species. So you see in April, immediately after the spring burn was administered in the spring burn plot, the mean flower abundance goes way, way down because it has just been burned. But by the time June comes along, the highest mean number of flowering plants is highest in the spring burn plot. And in general, there's not actually a very strong effect of seasonality here. And in fact, all of the different fire-treated units peak in flowering at the same time in the fall. And lastly, I want to mention that season of fire is something that may have very differential effects depending on the particular bees that you're interested in. And a lot of the research that's been done on bee response to fire is typically focused on whole bee communities. So people like to see all of the different species that occur in an area because, again, bees are such a diverse thing to look at. But it's really important to note that the bee community is something that is changing across the entire growing season. Just as with the flowering plant communities, there's continuous turnover of what species are, phenologically active when they peak in activity and when they decline. So it could be that there are specific bees that are associated with certain combinations of season of fire or fire frequency. And so those particular fire regimes may be doing really good things for populations of those bees while simultaneously having a detrimental effect on others. So more studies on specific taxa and population level studies are really needed, especially for habitat specialist bees like those that are depending on a limited number of floral resources. Okay, with that, I'd like to switch over to describing some results from a case study that I work on. This is at the Bridgestone Fire Demonstration Area, which is an ongoing restoration on the Cumberland Plateau in central Tennessee. And this is a really interesting place to work because the entire site is split up into 6 different units. And these units vary in their season of fire application. So they're burned either in the early growing season or the late growing season. And then for each of those 2 treatments, there's burns that occur every 1, 2, or 3 years. So there's 6 different types of combinations of frequency and timing of fire. And because of how important, again, these indirect effects of fire are on the vegetation, we want to pay very close attention to how the vegetation changes across these different units. So in this figure, we're looking at 4 different types of vegetation. We have forbs in the top left, grasses, semi-woody plants, and woody plants. And we are looking at percent cover of each of these functional groups of plants. And as you'll see, there's a lot of variation in the relative amount of cover of each of these things. You'll notice that for grasses, the units that are burned in the early growing season every 2 years have really high grasses, and units that are burned every 3 years have pretty high woody plant cover. But I want to direct your attention to forb cover, as this is the type of functional group of plant that is the most immediate importance to bees. And what we found in our case study is that plots that are burned in the late growing season every 1 or 2 years are supporting a much higher percent cover of forbs than either of the 3-year treatments, regardless of seasonality. And they're also numerically higher than early growing season 1 or 2-year unit burns. And this is the type of thing that we should all be keeping track of if you're interested in restoring savannas as bee habitat. And in terms of the interaction abundances, we saw that the unit, which is burned annually and in the late growing season, had the highest interaction abundances. So that's what's plotted on the y-axis here. And each point on this graph represents an individual pairwise interaction between a species of bee and a species of plant. And so again, the LGS, late growing season 1-year treatment, had a higher abundance of different types of interactions occurring when compared to things burned in the early growing season on a 2 or 3-year interval. Okay, so with that, I'll wrap this up. And my conclusions are that, at a global scale, we think that fire really tends to have a positive effect on a variety of different types of response variables that we're interested in for bees. Here in temperate savannas, frequent fires are largely beneficial to bees and bee plant interaction diversity, much like a lot of the other things that people research. Fire frequency is a really important thing. The relevance of fire season is going to be something that's a little bit system dependent and may vary depending on whether you're looking at taxa that are active in the spring or those active in the fall. And I would say we need more research done on these population level responses to fire, especially for habitat specialist bees. And with that, I will thank all my collaborators, some of whom are in the room today, and my funding sources, and I will take any questions.